Beginning a study today of the book, The ACOA Trauma Syndrome. It's by Tian Dalton. We'll begin here talking about adult children in the introduction. Um, Keep in mind, this book refers to adult children, or ACOA, most of the time. Sometimes COA, which means children of alcoholics. Sometimes PTSD, which means post-traumatic stress disorder. In any case, whatever the book is referring to, we can apply just about everything in this book to anyone that suffered any kind of childhood condition of separation, or anyone that grew up with a home where there's mental illness, or anyone that grew up in a home in which there's any kind of violence, or any kind of anger that's strongly expressed, and so on like that. Most people, in other words, that have suffered any kind of trauma or upsets in their past may begin to suffer from it in their adult lives. And so I just want to make that clear. This is not only about adult children of alcoholics. This is about a much wider range of people that suffer from any kind of trauma. And so we're picking up here in the recording from about 7 minutes into the introduction.
Adult children of alcoholics, ACOAs, can and often do suffer from some features of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, that are the direct result of living with the traumatizing effects of addiction. Years after we leave behind our alcoholic homes, we carry the impact of living with addiction with us. We import past unresolved pain into present-day relationships, but without much awareness as to how or why. And that is what this book is about. How living with addiction or dysfunction creates cumulative trauma, the effects of which can play out over a lifetime, and what to do to get better, and how getting better will open doors inside of you that you hardly knew were there. Family trauma need not be a life sentence. Trauma is actually fairly common. Most people grow up with at least 4 adverse childhood experiences. It is not necessarily the trauma that creates lasting problematic effects, but how we deal with it or don't deal with it when it occurs and afterward. Much can be done to ameliorate the effects of adverse childhood experiences. Supportive people, places to go that feel safe, and moving shock into some form of consciousness so pain does not remain hidden and unspoken can take a situation that could be traumatic and turn it into something that might be less damaging and potentially even character building. Our culture creates a sort of myth of happily ever after that is really no one's life. Feeling sad, anxious, or fearful is part of the human condition and does not necessarily require treatment. What makes trauma different from normal life stressors is that its effects tend to be long lasting and repetitive, and the patterns that are associated with a traumatic circumstance make their way through the generations. Our shock is long lasting, engraved in our neurological systems, and evidenced by how easily we can be triggered, how quickly our emotions go from 0 to 10. We experience a loss of neuromodulation, which translates into our losing some of our ability to self regulate. Feelings, even intense ones, come and go, but unresolved, hidden, and unprocessed trauma can last.
So two things that characterize someone who's suffering in a similar sort of way with this problem of neuromodulation being inadequately managed. They're suffering from two conditions. One is called enmeshment, in which the personalities of the people that were around them at the time that the trauma began are now enmeshed in their personality. In other words, their personality is shared with the personalities of these people that were involved with them at the time that they were traumatized. If they're people that are suffering from war trauma, then these are the people that surrounded them mostly, but also the people that were the enemy in many cases as well are enmeshed in the personality of the person that's suffering from the post-traumatic stress. Post-traumatic stress is also expresses itself in many other ways, such as mental illnesses. For example, anxiety and panic attacks oftentimes emerge from a post-traumatic stress situation. Also, borderline personality at a very young age, oftentimes people begin to enmesh with strong personalities from their home and the other personalities from their home. And they begin, in fact, to become part of a system in which they have many inner personalities. Dissociative identity disorder is another one related or similar to that, in which case the individual sometimes is not even conscious of the alternate identities at all. Not just they don't recognize the switch from one to another, but in fact, they have separate identities. And in fact, they may have physical characteristics and personalities that completely change. Additionally, people that develop mental illnesses such as schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, major depression also may be suffering from trauma as well. And it may not just be a genetic disorder that they're suffering from. Additionally, alcoholics, drug addicts, sex addicts, gambling addicts, and food addicts also are typically also suffering from enmeshment, in which case treating them without treating the enmeshment, in fact, is probably going to be somewhat fruitless. Additionally, people dysregulate. All of those people dysregulate. In other words, they have a hard time managing their personality. It has a mind of its own, in a sense, whether it's a separate, complete, different personality of its own, or whether it's enmeshed with other personalities from the time of trauma. It doesn't really make any difference. The fact is that dysregulating is the most common problem of all the different kinds of mental neurological disorders.
Because of the way the brain processes trauma, our most painful experiences may be the very ones that get repressed or thrown out of conscious awareness. While initially this allows us to function during overwhelming experiences that might otherwise immobilize us, eventually those feelings of fear and anxiety need to be felt rather than frozen. The family, while a perfect unit for raising young, can also be fertile ground for creating cumulative trauma throughout the developmental cycle. Our primary relationships are meant to nurture and sustain us until we are strong enough to survive on our own. When small children are terrified by the very same people who they would normally go to for comfort and safety, they become trapped in a confusing and disequilibrating system with no one to help them to restore their sense of normal and their feeling of emotional balance. They are then forced to come up with immature strategies to manage what feels unmanageable. Oftentimes, they just go numb, or they disassociate. They disappear on the inside. Recovery from the ACOA trauma syndrome is all about reclaiming the fragmented parts of self that are trapped in another psychological and emotional time and place and bringing them into the here and now. It is translating hidden emotion into words so that feelings can be processed, new insight and meaning can be gained, and experiences can be knitted back together with new understanding into a coherent and present oriented picture of the functioning self and the self in relation to others. It is learning to live in the present rather than in the past or future. This field has many pioneers whose remarkable sharing and collaborations over the years have lit a lamp for others to follow.
Pick up now in the beginning of the book. This is the introduction to part one. A few chapters here are designated as part one, and we'll see here some of the symptoms, some of the findings of modern research, and some of the difficulties that we haven't yet discovered maybe about ourselves. Probably not, unless we've done some kind of very deep, thorough look at what this trauma syndrome really is, with some medical focus, with someone who has been involved in treatment for a long time. Tian has over 45 years. I'm not sure exactly how many years she has, but more than 45 years of treatment and engagement, and she loves to write. And she's written a terrific book here for us to take apart and see how, in fact, we can be reconstructed if we're suffering from ACOA trauma syndrome, or if we're suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, or one of the related sort of personality disorders. In fact, there are many other personality disorders that I didn't mention, in fact, that could also fall into this area of that it starts with family trauma, or it starts with trauma at an early age, or being sexually abused at an early age, or being assaulted at an early age. Many things could have happened, which triggered a person into the problems of a post-traumatic stress type of trauma.
Part 1. Origins of the ACOA Trauma Syndrome. Either we have hope within us or we don't. It is a dimension of the soul, and it is not essentially dependent on some particular observation of the heart. It transcends the world that is immediately experienced and is anchored somewhere beyond its horizons. Hope, in this deep sense, is not the same as joy that things are going well or the willingness to invest in enterprises that are obviously headed for early success, but rather an ability to work for something because it is good, not just because it stands a chance to succeed. Hope is definitely not the same thing as optimism. It is not the conviction that something will turn out well, but the certainty that something makes sense, regardless of how it turns out. It is hope, above all, which gives us the strength to live and continually try new things. Václav Havel, author and politician.
So interestingly, Tien decides to deal with this disorder as it may seem to be, as if it was created in a war situation. And she calls this collateral damage. Growing up in the force field of addiction, a war zone sort of scenario.
Chapter 1. Collateral damage. Growing up in the force field of addiction. What we don't let out traps us. We think no one else feels this way. I must be crazy. So we don't say anything. And we become enveloped by a deep loneliness, not knowing where our feelings come from or what to do with them. Why do I feel this way? Sabrina Ward Harrison, artist and author. We're doing a great job of giving attention to addicts these days. The paparazzi are keeping scarved, hooded, and sunglassed celebrities on the front pages of newspapers and magazines, their hands outstretched to block the probing glare of cameras and careening, meddling microphones as they head to treatment. It's easy to capture addiction's image. It wears a certain disheveled, hungover look that we all recognize. But no one is snapping many pictures of the people they left behind, the rest of the family. Because how do you photograph a broken heart or a shattered self? What happens to the kids, the wives, the husbands, and the parents whose lives are devastated by the disease of alcoholism addiction? Those who are left dazed, numb, and in silent, secret pain because they've used up all of their resources, emotional, psychological, and financial, on getting the addict into treatment. How do they get well? Is the fallout from living with addiction like inhaling years of secondary smoke? Are they somehow at risk too? Probably. Especially impacted are children whose personality development is affected by growing up around the dysfunctional interpersonal relationship dynamics that surround addiction.
So this is also, don't forget, applying to people who lived in a home which was dysfunctional, where there perhaps were fights, loud yelling, upsetting difficulties and confusion, people that did not know how to get along with each other, that walked on eggshells sometimes, that screamed and shouted sometimes, that isolated themselves in their rooms sometimes. Crazy households always are involving trauma. What happens to the individual as they grow up? All kinds of insanity goes on in their minds, fantasies, and many pick up with some sort of addiction. Some of the problems also involve how that their body changes according to their mood, because they're always in a state of fight, flight, or freeze. Then, in fact, they may have various different kinds of problems with their bodies as well, sicknesses, all kinds of pains and and confusions and cramps and so on and so forth that don't seem to have a physical cause. Sometimes um, terrible headaches, migraines, all kinds of pain in their body. Perhaps their skin crawls with pain. Perhaps their skin goes numb. Perhaps their body goes numb. So they have emotional, psychological, physical problems, and typically also financial problems as well come into play. Many become addicted to drugs, alcohol, sex, violence, even, or perhaps for gambling or overeating and other types of addictions.
These dynamics become incorporated into their concept of self and self in relationship and get played out when they become adult children of alcoholics, addicts, ACOAs, with partners and families of their own. Consider these statistics. 1 out of every 4 children is a COA. 55% of all family violence occurs in alcoholic addicted homes. Incest is twice as likely among daughters and sons of alcoholics, addicts. Alcohol is a factor in 90% of all child abuse cases. ACOAs are 4 times more likely to become alcoholics, addicts than the general population. 50% of ACOAs marry alcoholics. 70% of ACOAs develop patterns of compulsive behavior as adults. These may include abusive patterns with alcohol, drugs, food, sex, work, gambling, or spending. That was the bad news. Here's some good news. COAs often develop valuable life skills that benefit them throughout their lives. They can become purposeful, strong, and resolute adults who are great at toughing it out and being creative, clever risk takers. Because they've developed unique strengths while meeting the challenges of their childhoods, ACOAs often go on to become independent and resourceful adults. They are CEOs and entrepreneurs, teachers, philanthropists, and politicians, and they flood the helping professions. They can be tireless overachievers. Yet while COAs and ACOAs are often full of talent, competence, and humor, they may find themselves marching double time in life, fueled by a need to somehow right a childhood wrong, and they may pay a price for this both in physical health and comfort in relationships. Birth of the ACOA movement. Though it may be difficult for those who grew up later to imagine, until 1980, none of us who were ACOAs knew it. We just thought we were maybe a little more complicated, perhaps a little darker than some of our friends. Maybe we knew that our parents drank a bit too much alcohol, a way bit too much perhaps, but we didn't know that was anything but a childhood experience that should be forgotten about. None of us really knew that it was a syndrome or that we'd been traumatized. We were clueless about the pain that we didn't feel a right to have. The trauma we were left with did not easily show itself. Sadness or fear might be hidden under a variety of veneers in the ACOA, not only the obvious hurt or angry face, but also a less obvious, sweet, wistful, if not vacant smile. An ACOA might also be someone hiding behind a mask of feigned complacency and functioning while being good and quiet and productive.
So this syndrome also applies to many other people where their parents were mentally ill, where their parents were dealing with anger, frustration, confusion, perhaps got very loud oftentimes, where there was a lot of inconsistencies. There is always this sort of same sort of trauma, very common in households, which you would never imagine to be true. My parents, I'm sure nobody outside of my home was aware that they fought with each other sometimes, that they argued loudly sometimes, that they, in fact, suffered sometimes from their childhood. And while they really didn't transfer this to the children in the household, we also picked up on many different kinds of confusion and upsets and worries and frustration. And I certainly suffered from a traumatic sort of stress, which I'm not going to describe in detail. I just will be very aware of many of the things that were brought out in this book as I was reading it. And as I've been reading this book again and again, I'm finding, in fact, there's even more in it that I hadn't really thought about in my recovery. So I've been many years into recovery, and I feel quite confident, in fact, that I've nearly fully recovered. But there are still many things that I must remind myself about staying patient and remind myself about using my mind correctly to see the right use of my mind is always to increase love and joy and peace and kindness and acceptance and tolerance, and to allow myself to accept people at whatever level they're at without needing to condemn them, nor without needing to intervene in some way as I must fix them. I must pay attention to my own set of symptoms and confusion and difficulties and complications which on occasion do arise. And I must therefore be willing to be helpful to others, to be genuinely, authentically, and truly available to be helpful to others. But I also must watch what I am doing with the use of my mind. I'll talk more about that as we go on through the book. Our mind can easily be separated from what we want in our hearts. We do want love and peace and joy and kindness. And we do want a good, deep, loving feeling about our family and so on. That can easily be lost when the mind does not know how to discipline itself to stay within the right use of itself, to see that it always must be working on increasing the values that contribute to being able to live in a loving, peaceful, and caring sort of world.
When the ACOA syndrome was given a name and face, it allowed those of us who were still reverberating from the pain of growing up with addiction to finally exhale. To everyone's amazement, ACOAs became a movement almost overnight. Thousands upon thousands of us poured out of the woodwork, breaking our isolation and embarrassment to connect with others who might understand, encouraged by the fact that we were not alone, nor were we crazy to be carrying childhood scars well into adulthood. We were ACOAs. We had a name, and there were a lot of us, a whole lot. We cried, felt our anger, met our heretofore banished inner children, and told them they could stop hiding. And we came to feel a renewed sense of hope and empowerment. Perhaps if we could know what was wrong with us, we might have a chance at correcting it.
In many cases, what she's speaking about here, she put inner child in quotes, and she put here that, in fact, we cried, felt anger, met our heretofore banished inner children. So she's actually talking about a personality which we recognize as very separate from our own adult personality. We have an inner, fearful, suffering child when we suffer from trauma at an early age, or at a older age. For example, in war situations, many people are surrounded by the personalities whom they were serving with, and also by the personalities, in some cases, of the enemy if they were prisoners and so on and so forth. And so they could be suffering from traumatic stress from a childhood and then compound that in a war situation where in fact their buddies are being killed or dismembered and so on like that. So these are very serious problems that can't be solved until we can look at the source of the trauma and then see, by allowing ourselves to become aware of our inner pain and suffering, to acknowledge it, in fact, is real to us, then in fact to be able to learn what to do about it. So this book is about all of that and more also. And I would have really liked to have been seeing it as called something a little different from this. But in fact, if you just listen carefully to every time she says ACOA, you say whatever you seem to be suffering from as a diagnosis, if you're given one, use that instead, because I guarantee you it will most of the time fit quite well.
Today, we know that ACOA's reaction to living in a chaotic environment, this unrelenting waiting for the other shoe to drop, for life to rupture or betray us all over again, actually has a name. It's hypervigilance, and it is part of a syndrome called post traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. When a person is unable to get away from a highly stressful situation, that is, if their survival urge to flee toward safety is thwarted, they are more likely to develop PTSD than if they can discharge their physiological urge to run or protect themselves. Those of us who grew up with addiction fit this description perfectly. How could we flee from our own homes? Where would we go? And the very people we wanted to flee from were our parents, who we needed and loved. The very people who we would have gone to for love, understanding, and protection were the ones who were traumatizing us. Our parents yelled, raged, or passed out in front of us, and we stood there frozen in fear, like deer in the headlights, revved up for fight or flight, but unable to move a muscle. But the feelings we stuffed did not disappear. Our mind body held on to them in a quivering silence. When ACOAs get triggered as adults, we return to those feelings and the mind body we lived in at those childhood moments. We stand there, stress chemicals coursing through our bodies, looking like grown ups, but feeling on the inside like helpless, frightened children. Naming and defining the ACOA syndrome gives us a way to finally understand ourselves, to feel our way out of our frozenness so that we could finally grow up on the inside. Many of us became deeply empowered by the ACOA movement, and many of us have made it our life's work to develop theory and research that flesh out exactly what it is that happens to the body, mind, and hearts of children who grow up with addiction and with the dysfunction and mental illness that are its constant bedfellows. The work that we have done over the past 30 years has moved from instinct and intuition to some of the most exciting research to emerge in the mental health field. Studies on trauma, neurobiology, and attachment have more or less proven what we were beginning to understand from our clinical observation: that the shocking, humiliating, and debilitating experiences that accompany living with addiction do, in fact, literally shape our neural networks, and that the personality complications caused by this early pain and stress can and often do emerge years and years after the original trauma. This is what the ACOA movement was all about: a post traumatic stress reaction. Long after children leave their alcoholic homes, they remain ensnared in repeating relationship patterns that are the direct result of having been traumatized in childhood. Old pain keeps reemerging in new relationships. The names and relationships may have changed, but the pain is always the same.
Okay, and the pain, in fact, is it also it has multiple variations, and we tend to go through several of them sometimes. So a person may become a hypochondriac because they have all kinds of symptoms that are related to physical disorders, even though they may not yet have a physical disorder. Perhaps one will develop, perhaps heart disease, blood pressure problems, and so on and so forth may develop. Stress-related kinds of conditions are likely to develop in someone who has not been able to deal with and to effectively liberate themselves from the post-traumatic stress type of fight, flight, or freeze situations, because they do become enmeshed with the personalities that surround them all during the course of their life. Then, in fact, their variation of the kinds of symptoms that they will suffer will be great, because all the many different personalities that they're enmeshed with will also become great. Dysregulation is one of the ways that we would not be able to recognize what specific problem does this person have when they go to see a psychiatrist. All the screening and so on and so forth, testing and so on and so forth that's involved could take many weeks or even months, or in some cases, their diagnosis will change from year to year because of the great complexity of these problems. Now, in my youth, in my younger adult years, much of this was not even recognized. As Tian said, it wasn't until the 1980s when it began to become widely recognized that post-traumatic stress was a much more deep problem than ever was thought. And there was a movement of inner child work that began to occur in the late 70s and into the 1980s and further. There was a great deal of work that was done by people who had suffered in their lives from post-traumatic stress disorder from childhood trauma, who had begun to recognize that they had to be able to look at the symptoms of those problems and to be able to categorize the symptoms of those problems in terms of where do they come from as far as the other personalities that they had become enmeshed with, and how could they stop the process of dysregulation before it would take over and cause them to get very depressed, very anxious, very angry, very much unable to suffer from the symptoms of the post-traumatic stress.
Those of us who work in the field see daily that this problem has only gotten bigger. And because it has only gotten bigger, many of us feel that it is time to reintroduce these concepts to the general public. We have come a very long way in our understanding of this syndrome and our ability to treat it. Studies on resilience have even taught us to value many of the adaptive qualities that ACOAs develop along the way, such as inventiveness, creativity, and humor, as well as how COAs learn to mobilize support within their young worlds so that they can thrive. With a deeper understanding of ACOA issues, trauma, and neurobiology, we are much better able to help people recover from it than we were when this movement began. Three types of ACOAs. In my experience, there are three types of ACOAs. The first type seems to feel that their alcoholic home did not affect them all that much, and since they are no longer living in it, they are fine. This group can be rather oblivious to the impact that they are having on those around them. They tend to act out their unresolved pain in controlling, enmeshing, or even abusive ways, and to have either overly intense emotional reactions or suspiciously low levels of reaction, having developed a pattern in childhood of alternating between intense emotional states and shutting down. The second type of ACOAs are fairly aware, but don't truly want to do the tough emotional work it will take to really deal with the pain they carry. It makes them feel too vulnerable and helpless to experience those difficult emotions, and or they feel disloyal, breaking the family secret that all was not so perfect. These ACOAs are confusing to be close to. They sound like they understand what dynamics may be at play in difficult interactions, but they go back and forth in terms of changing their own behavior. They give enough insight to make you want to come back for more, but not enough behavior change so you can really relax.
In sponsoring in the 12-step program in AAA, these people were the ones that most likely to ask me to sponsor them. It typically would not last very long. Unfortunately, also, many of these were the people that were destined to die of alcoholism and or drug use. And so because I wasn't able to help them, I looked very deeply into what's going on here. These people seem to understand me when I'm with them, and they seem to almost like instantly forget as soon as they go out the door. What is going on here? And so I began to find out that some people are so addicted to their ego style that in fact they don't want to change, even though they can understand it, even though they can converse very deeply about it, perhaps, they really don't want to change. And they're not going to. They might stay sober, but they'll always be suffering from the fact of that they're protecting their ego from the world, protecting their ego from their parents, from their spouses, from everyone. In fact, they're very difficult to be with, confusing to be close to. It goes way beyond that. They're difficult to be close to because their personality changes at the drop of a hat. And because they're so complicated and difficult to be with, nobody really wants to stay with them, even if they have children together. So it's a crazy world that they live in. And I typically don't really understand it very well, but I still do see, in fact, that because I did some work to understand it, I did a lot of work to understand the third type as well. And the third type is my pleasure to work with. They're generally highly motivated. Let's listen.
The third type wants to look at their past and are willing to do the work that it takes to do so. They learn to be different on the inside, and they experience enormous bursts of passion, creativity, and energy as they free up emotional, psychological, and physiological frozenness. They make significant personal changes that also translate into interpersonal changes. They may still be affected by their past, but they know what to do when their feelings become stormy and their self esteem takes a hit. They can adopt healthy ways of managing life circumstances. This group often comes to feel grateful for a painful past as it leads them to an enhanced awareness of life and love. They often report a deepened ability to engage with life, relationships, and their own spiritual path.
And so we'll see typically if we're in a 12-step program, we'll see most of the people come in that first category. Some of the people split off into that second category, and some of the people split off into this third category. I have worked with all the categories of the different kinds of types of um, suffering. And I can tell you, of course, the one I really want to work with and the one I do typically only work with now is this third type. I wait to find out what's happening in the switch over. Are they going to switch over into being more ego oriented and driven, or are they going to be more focused on a spiritual development and learning to be calm, peaceful, and patient, and therefore becoming great sponsors, great members of the program together to be helpful to each other, and people that you would really want to rely upon because they are the kind of people that, in fact, she talked about earlier, where they can be successful and they can be helpful and they can be dear, dear friends, or they can be even dear, dear loved ones or spouses and so on like that. Good parents, all that sort of stuff can happen in their lives.
Defining the ACOA trauma syndrome. The ACOA trauma syndrome is a post traumatic stress syndrome in which suppressed pain from childhood reemerges and is experienced, recreated, and lived out in adulthood. It is the direct result of growing up with the traumatizing dynamics of addiction or adverse childhood experiences. Years and years after leaving their addicted homes, ACOAs carry the pain of their past relationships into their partnering, parenting, and workplaces. Childhood feelings that were never identified, worked through, and understood get triggered and projected onto their adult relationships or sink into the body, where they increase chances of many illnesses, from hypertension to heart disease. But often, ACOAs don't know why any of this is happening or that it's happening at all. Years after the stressor has been removed, they live in a way as if they were still there. Years after they have left their childhood living rooms, developed careers, married, and had their own children, they remain hyper-vigilant. They wait for the other shoe to drop, for the people they love to betray, hurt, or humiliate them all over again. They carry their living rooms with them. When triggered, the present dissolves and gives way to remembrances of things past, and suddenly they are that hurt child all over again, frozen in place, not knowing what to say or do to bring this childhood feeling state into adult intelligence and language. They're trapped in an immature feeling state that belongs to a different time and place, but the unfelt needs, resentments, and wounds seem very real and about the present. And because they are in that state, they read the person or situation that triggered them as, in a sense, bigger than they are. They have little or no awareness of how their wounds from the past may be bleeding into their present and possibly their future. It is a cruel reality that the craziness, the sick and twisted emotional and psychological patterns of the addict can be contagious. You cannot live with this illness without catching it. Psyches, brains, and neurological systems are built to be porous and adaptive. Our neurological networks are shaped by those we are raised by. Who they are seamlessly becomes who we are through neurological patterning. Phenomena like limbic resonance or mirror neurons are being increasingly understood by research. We are actually biologically wired to pick up on and incorporate the rhythms and behaviors of others so we can learn habits, experience others empathically, and feel deeply connected. This is part of the phenomenon of attachment. We need to have the capacity to attach between parent and child and partner and to pair bond so that we can raise children successfully into adulthood. These emotional patterns are wired into us by nature, no longer nature versus nurture. Research reveals that both form the brain body templates from which we feel and behave. This deep attachment cuts both ways. It means that we share our joys and pains and help each other through them. It also means that the thinking, feeling, and behavior of a disease like addiction gets caught and mirrored by the whole family. The war at home. Research on Vietnam veterans has revealed how trauma from a past, relatively short period of time can hold soldiers and effectively all the people around them hostage for the rest of their lives. Though most soldiers make a successful readjustment, according to research, there is a significant group who continue to exhibit signs of post traumatic stress. Left unchecked, psychological wounds related to post traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, can alter a soldier's temperament and leave him with problems such as generalized anxiety, depression, occupational instability, marital conflicts, and family problems. Moreover, veterans with PTSD are more likely to report marital, parental, and other family adjustment problems, including violence, than veterans without PTSD. This is a phenomenon that can cause large psychic wounds of war to reemerge at a later date, long after the war is over. This reliving and recreation of past pain in present day relationships is what a post traumatic stress reaction is all about. The soldier coping with PTSD might rage or become violent with his spouse or children because violence has become, we might say, part of his psyche and his nervous system. He might withdraw into a preoccupied, confused world of his own because he knows no other way of managing his huge emotions or his paradoxically flat, shut down inner world. He cycles back and forth between unregulated extremes, moving from numbness to rage in literally the blink of an eye. He may turn to drugs or alcohol or sexual acting out to medicate the emotional pain and flashbacks that burden and disturb him.
So in an instant, and literally she means in an instant, they can change from happy, sort of laid back and relaxed to suddenly having flashbacks and suddenly suffering from extreme anxiety, maybe panic attacks, and so on and so forth, like that. Or they can become quickly immersed in, deeply immersed in drugs, alcohol, sexual acting out, and all other kinds of emotional pain can suddenly become something that just takes over their system, perhaps for a long time to come. Many people that came back from the Vietnam War and other wars since then have been studied in great detail to see, in fact, that this post traumatic stress war related injury is very, very serious. Suicides, murders, mass shootings, all different kinds of problems have been studied that are related to this kind of war post traumatic stress disorder.
Not surprisingly, the soldiers who are the most vulnerable for developing PTSD from war are those who experienced childhood trauma in the home. For the past 3 decades, the mental health field has been witnessing similar symptoms in those who grew up with adverse childhood experiences, such as abuse, neglect, and particularly addiction in the home. The phenomenon of adult children of alcoholics and addicts reveals its own version of pain from one part of life emerging long after the war is over. Children who grew up with adverse childhood experiences, who could not express or even experience their own emotional pain because their circumstances did not allow for it, may recreate in their adult relationships the painful experiences from their primary relationships in childhood.
So these adults will actually project their fear onto other people who have nothing really to do with their past, but seem to trigger them to be fearful about something that happened in their deep past. Maybe not even consciously aware that, in fact, they see these people as those kind of triggers to their personality to be suffering, fearful, and to be overwhelmingly sometimes anxious or depressed or psychotic. So these kind of things can happen very quickly to a person, even if it isn't a war situation, but especially to these people that have suffered in their childhood, perhaps, and then later also in war situations.
On the outside, ACOAs often have things well under control. On the inside, however, they may experience a low hum of negative feelings about the self, such as insecurity, inadequacy, phoniness, unlovableness, anxiety, or confusion. In times of chaos and crisis, ACOAs can be very composed and function well, but they may have trouble when things go normally, too slowly, are not under their control, don't go their way, or don't go as they expect.
So many of these people also, because they are having moments of time when they're hyper vigilant, and because the brain chemistry changes so rapidly because of their reactions to things at such a stressful level, then in fact, they can be also just caught up in the variance of their personality to quite a marked change that may occur in their personality. Behaviors will be out of their control. Their unmanageability will take over their mind, and they will suffer and oftentimes perhaps also make others suffer.
ACOAs and intimacy. Soldiers who have PTSD may duck at the sound of a car backfiring, unconsciously fearing that it is the sound of gunfire. Even though they are no longer anywhere near a battlefield, they carry the scars and the fear that make that loud sound still feel threatening. For ACOAs, the battlefield is oftentimes intimate relationships, and the loud sounds or triggers can be as innocuous as a fight in the next room, a sudden change of mood, or a tense or aggressive vocal tone. Because they were traumatized in their home and by the people who they loved and depended on for care, nurturance, and even basic survival, ACOA's fear and hypervigilance tend to reemerge when they create families of their own. Intimate relationships such as partnering and parenting are common ACOA triggers that reactivate childhood fears. As adults, when we encounter situations that feel similar to ones we experienced as kids, our fear gets triggered, but we don't really understand why because we never figured it out in the first place. We go back into a state of hyperarousal and hypervigilance, and all of the tangled mess of confused and conflicting feelings we experienced as kids seem to swarm around our heads, but we don't know what got us there or how to get out of it. Often, we erroneously link our feelings of fear to whatever is around us at the moment. Actually, it isn't so much those situations in and of themselves that are scaring us. We're afraid that those situations will trigger unconscious and unprocessed feelings that we won't be able to handle or make sense of. Beneath the level of our conscious awareness, we become a scared child all over again, triggered by something that reminds us of a time in our lives when we might have felt helpless, scared, and vulnerable. We become lost in a wordless web of unprocessed or disequilibrating emotions, not knowing how to sort them out or come back from them. Many adults, when in this state, do what they did as kids. They freeze like a deer in the headlights. They try to become invisible until their feeling of danger passes. It is part of the natural fear response. If no one sees me, no one will hurt me. How many times have I heard clients describe themselves as having felt invisible in their own homes? Was it that no one saw them, or did they find home a scary place? Were they invisible, or were they frozen in fear and experiencing themselves as disappeared? Still, another part of the trauma response is aggression or withdrawal. Triggered ACOAs may either intimidate people or avoid them in an attempt to avoid feeling vulnerable. Of course, these same intimate relationships can be the ACOA's path to healing, as they learn to back up when triggered and understand that within those triggered memories is the key to their unlocking and understanding just what hurt them most.
Many years ago, I taught many times a course called Interpersonal Relations, which in fact dealt with Maslow's hierarchy of needs and dealt with the stress syndrome. And in fact, I found, even though I taught it so many times, I found that with discussions with students, I always learned something new about the kinds of experiences that people seem to have to go through in order to get well. Many of the students I had were suffering from post-traumatic stress in their childhood, and many of them had gotten treatment for several years before they came and were able to go through school at an advanced level to get placed into good paying jobs. And so I learned a lot over and over again. I met lots of people with lots of different kinds of disorders. And then as time went on, I began to see, in fact, this enmeshment and this dysregulation that were common in every single case, whether it was actually post traumatic stress or whether it was actually a mental illness. It didn't make any difference. If we could address the fact that their personality had been so intertwined with somebody else's confusion, pain, suffering, and anger, then in fact we could see that they needed to address that. How would they address it? First with hope, then in fact with following directions to be able to deal with the situations and circumstances with cognitive based training or with um, acceptance commitment therapy or with the kind of therapy that comes along in other cases with more um, sorts of therapy that deal with we need to build up values for ourselves. The values for ourselves will then be able to be used so that we can learn to use our mind correctly to go towards this kind of artistic sort of living that we really want for ourselves, to be able to want to live with the truth about ourselves, to be able to do these evaluations that need to be done, to be able to see our way clear, to find ourselves being patient, calm, relaxed, and faithful, especially faithful to some kind of spiritual awareness, which allows us to grow out of the fears and into the realization that we are spirit and we need, in fact, the spiritual aspect of ourselves to fully recover. So the next section talks about when pain goes underground. And this is one of the most important things that has to do with separating that aspect that I talked about before, where people would come into the 12-step program and they would have a lot to learn in the first few months. And then they would sort of split into this egotistical type that likes to relapse, or they would split into this calm, more peaceful sort of self who generally wants to do the work to see themselves freed of their past and their suffering and their need to drink or drug or whatever it was.
When pain goes underground, think of it this way. You're a 7-year-old kid in a home where dad gets drunk and rages. Mom stands, exhausted, and tries to protect you some of the time, gives up and hides in her room some of the time, and joins dad in raging some of the time. You, the kid, are scared and quite trapped. You can't really run away. This is your home, after all. If you talk back, or worse, try to fight, you might get hit or sent to your room, or worst of all, made to stay and live through one of those humiliating, soul pounding lectures about how bad you are. Or you might get ignored and feel yourself literally disappearing. So you feel helpless and you sort of collapse and go numb, or you freeze. You go away somewhere into your imagination while your body still stands there. In this scene, there is a power imbalance for sure, and you're at the short end of it. You have little access to outside sources of support. You are, after all, only 7. And the person or people you would generally go to for comfort and solace are the ones who are hurting you. All of these factors make this a traumatizing moment for a child. And to add to it, you are making sense of it all through the eyes of a 7-year-old. You may wonder, as children do, what went wrong and how to fix it. You may feel inept at helping or blame yourself. So you can feel not only hurt, but also confused, responsible, at fault, and unable to do anything about it. In other words, you feel helpless. And you may not have people you can go to for a quick reality check. So you swallow this scene whole. The picture gets frozen right there, and so do the feelings surrounding it. And that picture doesn't necessarily change much over time. It lives inside the psyche, where it becomes double and triple exposed with other similar pictures. And many of these scenes get blended together in a sort of inner portrait of the self and the self in relationship. Later, these inner pictures get played out in our adult relationships. They template further experience. So do the good pictures, by the way. They just don't give us as many problems, so we don't worry about them. This is the dilemma of the ACOA, the dilemma that we will explore in more depth throughout this book.
So we see here these inner pictures. Um, they tend to drive us towards fantasies about the good part of ourselves. They tend to drive us toward drinking, drugging, and anger and sadness and panic attacks in the other side of ourselves. So, it's almost like there's nothing going to be good because we're suffering from post-traumatic stress related types of disorders. It's almost like there's nothing that's going to be good in your life. If in fact that's the kind of life that you're having, that's oscillating between these two kinds of states they're opposed to each other, and they're not in agreement with much of anything actually.
Leaching and leaking of buried pain. When we grow up and have families and relationships of our own, those inner pictures of the self and the self in relationship reemerge. Neatly filed feelings, actions, and imagery that we imagined were well hidden fly out of their envelopes and folders straight into and onto everyone's faces. And those pictures have incredible detail. It is amazing just how carefully the unconscious records, remembers, and recreates what has gone before. A random familiar smell, texture, or a few bars of music, and we sail back into a forgotten moment of time in the blink of an eye. Past becomes prologue. At that moment, when we are triggered, we become trapped by our own unresolved history and set up to repeat it. Though we may occupy an adult body, we return to this child place inside of ourselves. In addition to the psychological and emotional bind we may find ourselves in when we're triggered, our bodies are also reliving the trauma. Our breath gets short, our hearts may pound, our stomachs flip flop, our throat goes dry, and our muscles tense up. We feel helpless and unable to make decisions all over again. In this way, the ACOA trauma syndrome involves both the body and mind, and healing from it is a mind body process. Recovering from PTSD is just as important as recovering from addiction and needs to be taken just as seriously. ACOAs need to sober up emotionally and psychologically so they do not live out the sort of dry drunk patterns that mirror addiction related thinking, feeling, and behavior, even when alcohol and drugs are not in the picture. Trauma and PTSD invariably become intergenerational. Even if the ACOA or traumatized adult does not become an addict, though many do, he or she passes on the kind of emotional and psychological thinking, feeling, and behavior that can engender trauma, addiction, and dysfunction in subsequent generations.
So next time I'll continue with chapter 2. I can't guarantee that I'm going to be able to record all of this book and make commentary throughout the book, but I am offering my group book study, which is on Thursdays at 5:30 p.m. Eastern Time in the United States. And for those people that are wanting to go through this book, this is an excellent way to do it. To read it with other people together. I'll make commentary on it. Other people put in comments of their own also. It goes a little slower than today as far as the amount of material that's covered in some cases. In other cases, we'll cover the whole chapter. For example, chapter 2 probably will be covered in completion on this next Thursday. So today's the 4th of May, and in 7 days, on the 11th of May, I'll be doing this book at 5:30 Eastern Time, at 2:30 Pacific Time, and somewhere in between, you probably can figure it out, or someplace in Europe or someplace otherwise that could be able to be with us. You're welcome as well. You'll see me on Facebook, and this is where, in fact, I will be posting this, as well as on YouTube, and it's an open invitation. This is 2003 May 4th, and for several more weeks. I think there's 17 chapters altogether. So at least 17 more weeks I'll be going through this book in great detail with commentary and with encouragement for people that need to get well, that maybe even didn't know that they were very deeply sick if they were post-traumatic stress disorder kind of suffering that's been going on in their lives. Everyone can benefit by this book. Just about anyone knows somebody who's actually suffering from the conditions that are being talked about here in this book. So thanks for joining me, and hope to see you again in the future.